I'm a 36-year-old father of two, married to my wife Sarah, 34F. We have two amazing kids, Ethan 6 and Lily 4. We love them more than anything, but unfortunately, Sarah's parents don't seem to share that sentiment. Her mom and dad have always made it painfully obvious that they have a clear favorite when it comes to their grandchildren, and it isn't our kids. That title belongs to my wife's sister Rachel's kids, three golden grandchildren, ages 8, 10, and 12, who can seemingly do no wrong in the eyes of their grandparents. The favoritism isn't subtle. It's not even something we're imagining. It's been happening for years. And despite multiple conversations, confrontations, and second chances, my in-laws continue to treat my kids like second-class citizens in their own family. At first, Sarah and I brushed it off. We didn't want to jump to conclusions or cause unnecessary drama. Maybe we were overthinking it, maybe we were being too sensitive, but then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every Christmas, Rachel's kids got top-of-the-line gifts, the latest gaming consoles, designer clothes, even an entire trip to Disney World one year, all fully paid for by my in-laws. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lily got coloring books, dollar store toys. One year, they didn't even bother wrapping their gifts. Birthdays were the same story. Rachel's kids got elaborate parties at expensive venues, complete with custom cakes, party favors, and bouncy castles. My kids? If they were lucky, my in-laws would show up with a card stuffed with a crumpled $5 bill. If they showed up at all, it didn't stop there. If my kids tried to talk at family gatherings, my mother-in-law would shush them and turn her attention back to Rachel's kids. If Ethan proudly showed off his school artwork, mother-in-law would barely glance at it before gushing about Rachel's daughter's latest dance recital. When my son lost his first tooth, they barely acknowledged it. Meanwhile, when Rachel's son lost his, mother-in-law made a whole Facebook post about it. But the real breaking point happened at a recent family gathering. I had stepped out to grab a drink when I overheard mother-in-law talking to one of her sisters. "It's just different," she said. Sighing, "Rachel's kids are our real grandkids, you know. Ethan and Lily, well, they're just the lesser grandkids." The lesser grandkids. I froze. I had to double check that I heard her correctly. Maybe I misunderstood, but no, she said it, clear as day. Something in me snapped. I walked straight back into the room and called her out in front of everyone. "Did I just hear you call my kids the lesser grandkids?" Her eyes widened for a split second before she waved me off with a fake laugh. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke." A joke. Sarah was standing next to me and the look on her face said it all. She wasn't surprised. She was hurt, but not surprised. Because this wasn't new. This was just the first time they had been careless enough to say it out loud. Father-in-law awkwardly tried to change the subject. The rest of the family shifted uncomfortably. Rachel, of course, rolled her eyes and sighed like I was making a big deal out of nothing. Later that night, Sarah and I sat down and talked. This wasn't just about Christmas gifts or birthday parties. This was about years of favoritism, about the way our children were being treated like they weren't as valuable, as loved, as worthy as their cousins. Sarah tried to address it privately, hoping maybe, just maybe, they'd finally understand how much they were hurting our kids. But mother-in-law and father-in-law brushed it off again. "We love all our grandkids equally," they said. Sarah laid out example after example of how they clearly didn't. They gaslight her, dismissed her concerns, made her feel crazy for even bringing it up. "We don't have to prove our love," father-in-law said, shaking his head. "This is just drama." Drama, that's what they called it. We might have been able to deal with it if it were just us being affected. But Ethan was old enough to start noticing. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with big innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, why don't Grandma and Grandpa like us as much as they like our cousins?" I felt my heart break in that moment. Sarah and I weren't crazy. We weren't overreacting. If a 6-year-old could pick up on the blatant favoritism, then it was real. We decided to confront Rachel, hoping that maybe, since she was also a parent, she'd understand how deeply this was affecting our kids. She shrugged it off. "You're reading too much into it. Mom and Dad don't mean any harm." I stared at her, speechless. Easy for her to say. Her kids were the ones getting adored, showered with gifts, praised like royalty. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "How would you feel if the roles were reversed? If your kids were treated the way ours are?" Rachel didn't answer. That was when I knew. Talking wouldn't fix this. There was no reasoning with people who refused to acknowledge reality. So, I decided to change tactics. If they wanted to treat my kids like the lesser grandkids, then fine. But they were about to find out what it felt like to be on the outside looking in. They wanted distance. I was about to give it to them. After the confrontation at the family gathering, Sarah and I made a silent decision. We were done chasing after people who didn't care about our kids. So, we stopped. No calls, no texts, no visits. We wanted to see how long it would take for mother-in-law and father-in-law to notice our absence. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Nothing. Ethan and Lily weren't asking about their grandparents, because honestly, mother-in-law and father-in-law were never around much to begin with. The only time they saw our kids was when we made the effort to bring them around. We figured if mother-in-law and father-in-law actually cared, they'd reach out. 3 weeks in, Sarah's phone finally pinged with a message from mother-in-law. She didn't ask how Ethan and Lily were doing, didn't even acknowledge the fact that she hadn't seen them in nearly a month. Instead, she asked why we hadn't visited lately. Sarah didn't sugarcoat it. "We figured you'd rather spend time with your favorite grandkids." Mother-in-law's response? A single passive-aggressive emoji. No denial. No attempt to fix things. Just that. The next weekend, we made sure to skip a big family gathering that we would normally be expected to attend. Instead, we packed up the kids and took them on a weekend trip to an amusement park. We posted pictures of Ethan and Lily grinning ear to ear on roller coasters, stuffing their faces with cotton candy, making real childhood memories with people who actually cared about them. A day later, mother-in-law finally noticed. A simple text, "Didn't see you at the family get-together. Everything okay?" My reply was just as simple, "Didn't think our presence would be missed." She didn't respond. A few days later, Rachel reached out. Mother-in-law and father-in-law had started asking questions. Why weren't we coming around? Why were we acting so distant? Rachel brushed it off at first, the way she always had. "They think you're being sensitive," she said with a sigh. But there was something different this time. A hesitation, a flicker of doubt that hadn't been there before. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to question things herself. Right, because expecting basic respect for my kids was apparently asking for too much. Instead of arguing, we kept our distance. We didn't just stop showing up. We stopped sending pictures, stopped sharing updates, stopped acting like we cared whether they were involved or not. And just like that, mother-in-law and father-in-law didn't ask about Ethan and Lily at all. Weeks passed. Not a single check-in. Instead of waiting around, Sarah and I decided to create our own traditions. We hosted game nights with friends, invited family members who actually cared about our kids, and made sure Ethan and Lily were surrounded by love. Then, one night, Sarah got a text from mother-in-law. "I just don't understand why you're shutting us out." She ignored it. An hour later, father-in-law called me. Unlike mother-in-law, father-in-law wasn't as aggressive about defending her. He asked what was going on, why we had been distant. I laid it out, the blatant favoritism. The way Ethan and Lily were always treated as second class. The lesser grandkids comment. Father-in-law stammered through an excuse, but didn't deny it. Then came the usual defensive statement. "Your kids just don't have the same bond with us as Rachel's kids do." I let that sink in before responding. Exactly. That's why we're focusing on people who actually care about them. That ended the conversation real fast. A week later, Rachel sent Sarah another message. "Mom and Dad are upset you're cutting them off." Sarah, without missing a beat, texted back. "They never had a problem ignoring our kids before." Silence. At this point, mother-in-law must have realized she was losing control. She finally called, but instead of an actual apology, she gave us a half-hearted excuse about how she didn't mean it like that. She never said what it was, never acknowledged the words she used. Just a vague misunderstanding. We weren't buying it. So when Thanksgiving rolled around, we made other plans. Instead of sitting through another awkward holiday watching Rachel's kids get treated like royalty, we booked a family vacation to a beautiful cabin with friends. No stress, no guilt, just a peaceful holiday with people who genuinely wanted to be around us. Mother-in-law found out through social media and immediately had a meltdown. She sent a long, rambling message about how we were tearing the family apart and how holidays are about togetherness. I simply replied, "You never included us in the first place." Father-in-law, on the other hand, reached out one last time. This time, he asked if there was any way to fix things. I made it clear, Ethan and Lily deserve to be treated the same as their cousins. That was non-negotiable. Father-in-law didn't argue. He just sighed. "I'll talk to your mother-in-law." Then came something unexpected. A cousin, one we weren't particularly close to, reached out privately. She told me she had seen everything happening and wanted me to know we weren't alone. Apparently, mother-in-law had been playing favorites for years, not just with Rachel's kids, but with other cousins too. There were entire branches of the family who had distanced themselves from mother-in-law and father-in-law because of this exact behavior. It wasn't just us, it was a pattern. And for the first time, mother-in-law and father-in-law seemed to realize they had a real problem. Not because they actually felt bad, but because for the first time ever, they were starting to feel real consequences. Sarah and I decided to sit back and wait. We weren't going to chase after them. If mother-in-law and father-in-law wanted to fix this, they had to prove it. And from the looks of it, they weren't ready to do that yet. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, the Christmas invitation arrived. Mother-in-law sent a message acting like nothing had happened. No mention of the confrontation, no mention of the silent treatment, just a casual, "looking forward to seeing everyone for Christmas dinner." Sarah and I didn't respond. We had no intention of going. A few days later, mother-in-law followed up. This time, she asked directly if we were coming. I didn't dance around it. "If Ethan and Lily aren't treated equally, we're not coming." Silence. Then, minutes later, another text popped up. Rachel. She started in immediately, telling Sarah we were overreacting, that we were being dramatic, and should let it go. Sarah didn't engage, but I did. I asked her, Plain and simple, would you let it go if your kids were treated like ours? No response. Later that night, father-in-law called, but this time, he actually told the truth. Mother-in-law had always favored Rachel, even when they were kids. He admitted it wasn't fair, but he also didn't want to rock the boat. I asked him straight up, if you see the problem, why don't you fix it? No answer. A day later, mother-in-law snapped. She sent Sarah a long-winded text about how we were the ones causing problems, how we were distancing the family and poisoning the grandkids against them. I sent back a single response. We're just treating you the way you've treated our kids for years. Feels bad, doesn't it? No response. Christmas came and went without us. Instead of forcing our kids to watch their cousins get showered in love while they got ignored, we took them on a beautiful vacation. No drama, no forced smiles, just genuine joy. Meanwhile, mother-in-law sent passive-aggressive messages all day. We didn't answer. Then, on Christmas Eve, mother-in-law called. Her voice was shaky. She told Sarah, I miss you. Things don't feel the same. Sarah listened for a moment before calmly responding. Now you understand how Ethan and Lily feel. Then she hung up. The next day, something unexpected happened. Father-in-law called, but this time, he actually apologized. He admitted he had never realized how deep the hurt went. How, when he really thought about it, mother-in-law had always prioritized Rachel, at the expense of Sarah, and now our kids. Then, he asked for a second chance. Sarah and I talked. We weren't ready to forgive mother-in-law, but father-in-law, maybe. We laid out clear conditions. If mother-in-law and father-in-law genuinely wanted to be in our kids' lives, they had to treat them equally. No favoritism. No lesser grandkids garbage. Father-in-law agreed. Mother-in-law, on the other hand, she was too quiet. A week later, the cousin who had reached out before messaged again. Be careful. Mother-in-law might just be playing the long game, pretending to change so she can regain control. I kept that in mind. Then, something unexpected happened. Mother-in-law started making an effort, though it felt calculated. At first, she sent small gifts, things she could dismiss as little gestures. Over the weeks, those small gestures turned into more extravagant gifts, like a tablet for Ethan and a custom dollhouse for Lily. But even with these efforts, something felt off. It was too sudden, too deliberate, as if she was trying to buy back control rather than genuinely change. Sarah immediately side-eyed it. This isn't an apology. This is damage control. I agreed, but we didn't react. We waited. And just as we expected, the golden grandkids noticed. Rachel's kids, who had been used to being the center of mother-in-law's world, did not like the shift. At a family event we skipped, Rachel's oldest was overheard whining that mother-in-law had been too busy making sure Ethan and Lily liked their gifts. Mother-in-law was scrambling. For the first time, she had to put in effort, and Rachel's kids were not happy about it. The irony wasn't lost on me, but something still felt off. Mother-in-law had spent years making sure our kids knew where they stood. Now, suddenly she cared? This wasn't remorse. This was desperation, and we were nowhere near done. After Christmas, mother-in-law switched tactics. She went from ignoring Ethan and Lily to suddenly acting like the world's most devoted grandmother. Multiple texts a day, asking how they were, what they were doing, sending random gifts. At first, it was small things, stickers, little toys, books. Then bigger things started arriving. A personalized blanket, a box of expensive clothes, a Nintendo Switch out of nowhere. It was too much, too fast. At first, father-in-law remained silent, neither defending nor questioning mother-in-law. But over time, as the family dynamic shifted, he started to reach out, small things at first, like a casual check-in, or asking about the kids' school. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't a grand gesture, but slowly, it seemed like he was beginning to understand the damage that had been done. Mother-in-law, though, it was obvious she was playing a game. Rachel was the first to complain. She started making snide remarks about how mother-in-law and father-in-law were trying too hard with our kids. It didn't take long before Rachel's kids started noticing the shift, too. At a gathering we skipped, Rachel's daughter made a fuss about how grandma wasn't paying as much attention to them. Rachel was annoyed. She didn't like sharing the spotlight. Sarah and I kept watching from a distance. One night, mother-in-law called Sarah. Her voice was thick with forced emotion. She didn't apologize, didn't admit what she'd done, just dramatically said, I just want our family back together. Sarah didn't react. She simply said, then start treating Ethan and Lily like they matter. Mother-in-law stammered, well, I'm trying, aren't I? That was all we needed to hear. It wasn't about them. It was about her. So we decided to test her. We invited mother-in-law and father-in-law over for dinner. Not a big event, just a normal family meal to see if she had actually changed. Father-in-law showed up first. He greeted Ethan and Lily warmly, asked about school, sat down and listened to them talk. He was actually trying. Mother-in-law arrived shortly after, carrying a bag full of gifts. Instead of talking to Ethan and Lily, she handed them presents like bribes. Dinner started, and the difference between mother-in-law and father-in-law was painfully obvious. Father-in-law asked questions, engaged with the kids. Mother-in-law, she struggled. She kept looking at Rachel's kids, as if waiting for them to appear. She made awkward comments like, "Oh, Ethan, you're actually really smart," as if she was surprised. Sarah and I exchanged a look. She hadn't changed at all. Then came the real test. Ethan's birthday was coming up. For the first time ever, mother-in-law offered to host the party at her house. That had never happened before. Not once. We agreed, but we stayed cautious. The party arrived and mother-in-law went all out. Balloons, decorations, an expensive cake. At first, everything seemed fine. Then the shift happened. Rachel's kids arrived, and suddenly, mother-in-law's focus changed. She hyped up Rachel's kids the whole time, asking about their school, their activities, making a big deal over the smallest things. Ethan barely acknowledged. Then came the moment that sealed it. When it was time to cut the cake, mother-in-law turned to Rachel's oldest son and asked him to help cut it. Not Ethan, the birthday boy. The reason we were there. Completely ignored. I saw Ethan's face drop. Sarah didn't hesitate. Loud and clear, she said, "It's Ethan's birthday. He'll cut his own cake." Mother-in-law's face turned red, but she didn't argue. She knew she had messed up. Ethan took the knife and cut the cake himself, just like he was supposed to. We stayed for another 30 minutes, but the decision was already made. Mother-in-law hadn't changed. She never would. On the drive home, Ethan, with his innocent 6-year-old voice, asked, "Why did Grandma act like it wasn't my birthday?" That was the final straw. Sarah and I weren't playing this game anymore. This was mother-in-law's last chance, and she failed. The car ride home from Ethan's birthday party was quiet. Too quiet. Then, from the back seat, Ethan spoke up. "Why did Grandma act like it wasn't my birthday?" Sarah and I exchanged a glance. We had always known mother-in-law treated our kids as second class, but this was humiliating. And Ethan noticed. This wasn't something we could excuse or explain away. This was the final straw. The next morning, mother-in-law sent a text. "Hope Ethan had fun. Sorry if the party felt rushed." Sarah didn't reply. We didn't make the decision lightly. There was no single moment where we declared ourselves finished, just a slow, exhausting realization that nothing would ever change. So instead of chasing after a family that refused to love our kids equally, we made the hardest but healthiest choice. We walked away. By the end of the week, Rachel noticed the shift. She messaged Sarah asking why we were suddenly being distant. "Are you seriously cutting them off over a birthday party?" Sarah didn't argue. She sent back a simple message. It wasn't just a party, it was years of this. Rachel left it on read. A few days later, father-in-law reached out. Unlike mother-in-law, he wasn't defensive. He asked to meet privately, and I agreed. We met at a coffee shop. Father-in-law sat across from me, looking tired, like he already knew what I was going to say. I didn't hold back. For years, mother-in-law has treated Ethan and Lily like they don't matter. I won't let them grow up thinking they aren't good enough. Father-in-law didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes downcast. He knew. When the conversation ended, I made it clear. We're done. Father-in-law looked upset, but he didn't try to change my mind. He just sat there, letting the weight of it sink in. The next day, mother-in-law called. Her voice was shaky. She was crying, acting like she was the victim. She didn't apologize. Instead, she went on and on about how she didn't deserve this. I cut her off. Ask Ethan how he felt at his own birthday party. Silence. Then the call ended. Rachel wasn't done. She took the family group chat and turned it into a battlefield. Long messages about how Sarah and I were ruining the family, how we were being petty, how mother-in-law and father-in-law had always tried their best. I didn't engage. I didn't have to, because something unexpected happened. Some family members agreed with us. A few aunts and cousins called out mother-in-law's favoritism. Others tried to defend her, saying family is family. I didn't care. My kids came first. Later that evening, father-in-law texted me privately. "I understand why you're doing this. I'll always be here for the kids." I respected that, but mother-in-law, she would never change. A week later, at school, Rachel's oldest son approached Ethan. "Why don't you come to Grandma's anymore?" Ethan shrugged. "She doesn't like me as much." Even the kids saw it. Mother-in-law tried everything. Texts, calls, even showing up at our house once. We ignored it all. Then came the last attempt. A long email filled with fake remorse, misunderstandings, excuses, and a plea to see the kids. I deleted it. For the first time in years, there was peace. No forced gatherings, no awkward moments watching Ethan and Lily be ignored. Our kids were happier. They weren't questioning their worth anymore. Then, Rachel made one last jab, a vague post on social media. Sad how some people cut off family over petty things. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because at the end of the day, I hadn't just taught mother-in-law a lesson. I had taught my kids that they never have to accept being treated as less than anyone else. And that was the real win. Cutting off mother-in-law and father-in-law wasn't a dramatic explosion. It wasn't a big emotional confrontation. It was silence. and that's what made it so effective. At first, mother-in-law acted like nothing had changed. She carried on with family gatherings, playing the perfect grandmother to Rachel's kids, pretending like she wasn't missing two of her grandkids entirely. But it didn't take long for the extended family to notice. A few aunts and uncles started asking where we were. Normally, we would have been there, making an effort, keeping the peace. Now, nothing. Mother-in-law tried brushing it off at first. Oh, they're just busy. But when months passed and we still didn't show up, people started questioning her. Cousins who had always suspected mother-in-law's favoritism finally saw it for what it was. They knew something was off, but now that we were gone, it was undeniable. Some of them reached out, telling us they understood. Others started pulling away from mother-in-law too, realizing she wasn't the loving family matriarch she pretended to be. One afternoon, months after the cutoff, father-in-law showed up, alone. He looked uncomfortable, hands shoved in his pockets, but he didn't beat around the bush. He asked if he could see Ethan and Lily, just him. We agreed, under one condition. Mother-in-law couldn't be involved. Father-in-law sat with Ethan and Lily for an hour that day. No gifts, no fake grand gestures, just sitting, talking, listening. It was the most effort he had made since they were born. Before he left, he admitted something. Mother-in-law has always favored Rachel, even when we were kids. Then, after a long pause, I regret never standing up to her. It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. And for the first time, father-in-law seemed to actually understand what had happened. At first, Rachel didn't think our absence would matter. She had always been the golden child. She assumed things would carry on as usual. But then mother-in-law started micromanaging her kids. Without Ethan and Lily around, mother-in-law focused entirely on Rachel's family. She became overbearing, controlling. Suddenly, Rachel's kids couldn't do anything without mother-in-law's interference. If they had an event, mother-in-law had to be involved. If they made decisions, mother-in-law had opinions. Rachel, little by little, started to see what we had been dealing with for years. It wasn't an immediate revelation. It was the slow wear of MIL's constant demands, the quiet resentment that built up over time until she couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, out of nowhere, Sarah got a message. I get it now. It's exhausting. That was it. No excuses. No defenses. Just that. Mother-in-law had turned her favorite child into another pawn, and Rachel finally saw it. Mother-in-law, now feeling the walls closing in, tried reaching out again. She left voicemails, sent messages, even tried getting other family members to guilt us into speaking to her. We ignored it. We had given her chances. She had failed every single one. Father-in-law, however, kept showing up. He never tried to force mother-in-law back into our lives. He just made real effort with Ethan and Lily, attending school events, calling regularly, remembering the little things. For the first time, he was a real grandfather. As mother-in-law became more suffocating, Rachel's kids started pulling away. They didn't want to visit as much. They didn't enjoy the attention anymore. They started complaining. Mother-in-law's control over the golden grandkids was slipping. The breaking point came when mother-in-law tried making a decision about Rachel's kids without consulting her. Rachel, who had spent her whole life defending mother-in-law, snapped. She started distancing herself, refusing to entertain mother-in-law's constant interference. With Rachel pulling away and us completely gone, mother-in-law realized she had lost control of the family dynamic. For years, she had dictated everything: who was important, who got attention, who mattered. Now, no one was listening to her anymore. One evening, mother-in-law sent one last desperate text. I don't understand why you hate me. I responded with a simple truth. I don't hate you. I just won't let my kids feel unloved. No response. She spent years playing favorites. Years acting like only one set of grandkids mattered. Now, she had nothing. No grand revenge. No dramatic confrontation. Just silence. And freedom. We moved forward. Our kids grew up without her negativity. Mother-in-law wanted control. Instead, she got exactly what she deserved. Nothing. After months of mother-in-law tightening her grip on Rachel's family, Rachel finally snapped. It happened at a family dinner, one that Sarah and I weren't invited to, but word got back to us fast. Mother-in-law had been going on and on about how sad it was that our kids weren't around anymore, how certain people had decided to tear the family apart over nothing. Rachel, already irritated from mother-in-law's constant meddling, lost it. She called mother-in-law out in front of everyone, saying mother-in-law didn't care about family, only about controlling people. She said it was no surprise Sarah and I had left, and if mother-in-law kept acting this way, maybe she should too. Mother-in-law wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by Rachel. The golden child had finally turned against her. Mother-in-law panicked. She burst into tears, saying her daughters were turning on her, that she was being abandoned after everything she had done for the family. Father-in-law, who normally would have stepped in to calm her down, just sat there unmoved. That's when father-in-law finally lost patience. He told mother-in-law, right there at the table, that maybe instead of blaming everyone else, she should ask herself why people were pulling away. Mother-in-law was stunned. Later that night, she tried another tactic, a desperate call to Sarah. Her voice trembled as she talked about how Rachel wasn't speaking to her, how she didn't know what to do, how she felt like she was losing her family. Sarah let her talk. Then when mother-in-law finally stopped, she responded with one sentence. "Now you know how Ethan and Lily felt." And then she hung up. A few days later, Rachel called me. She wasn't defensive this time. She wasn't dismissive. Instead, she vented. Mother-in-law was driving her insane, making everything about herself, inserting herself into every little decision, acting like she was owed something for simply being a grandmother. Rachel admitted she used to think Sarah and I were overreacting, but now she understood. Father-in-law reached out again not long after. He asked if he could take Ethan and Lily to the park. Alone. No mother-in-law, just him. We agreed. For the first time ever, our kids got one-on-one time with their grandfather, no manipulation, no guilt, no mother-in-law overshadowing them. Just a normal, peaceful day at the park. Father-in-law even sent pictures of them playing, something he had never done before. Meanwhile, mother-in-law was spiraling. She took to Facebook, posting vague statuses about how family turns their backs on you, about how some people forget where they come from. It was obvious she was trying to bait us, but we didn't engage. Then, a cousin sent Sarah a screenshot from a private family group chat. Mother-in-law was in there ranting about how Sarah had poisoned me against them, how she had always been trying to take me away from my family. Sarah just laughed. Mother-in-law still refused to take any accountability. Rachel started distancing herself even more. She stopped bringing her kids to visit as often. She started setting boundaries, something mother-in-law wasn't used to. Mother-in-law noticed. The golden grandkids, once the center of her world, started noticing mother-in-law's desperation. Instead of feeling special, they started finding her clingy and overbearing. She wanted constant updates. She tried guilting Rachel's kids into visiting more. She showed up unannounced. Father-in-law, meanwhile, kept showing up for Ethan and Lily. He didn't push, didn't demand. He just made an effort. Small things, like calling to check on them, remembering important dates, actually being present. Mother-in-law, realizing she was losing control, tried dragging the extended family into it. She called aunts, uncles, cousins, trying to rally them to her side. It backfired. More than one relative told her outright, "You did this to yourself." The shift was undeniable. Mother-in-law had spent years blaming Sarah for ruining the family, but now, even Rachel admitted mother-in-law was always the problem. With no one left to control, mother-in-law's world shrunk. She had spent so long dictating who was important, who was worthy, who mattered. Now, no one was listening to her anymore. A few months after mother-in-law lost control of the family, she made her last big move. An email. It was long, dramatic, and full of empty words. She wrote about how she had seen the error of her ways, how she just wanted to be a loving grandmother again. She talked about how families should stick together, how she missed everyone so much. It was a classic guilt trip wrapped in fake self-reflection. Sarah read the whole thing once, then replied with a single sentence. "An apology without change is just manipulation." Mother-in-law didn't respond. Rachel, meanwhile, was dealing with her own fallout. Mother-in-law's obsession with maintaining control over her family had exhausted Rachel's kids. They didn't want to visit anymore. Rachel admitted that every time she mentioned going to grandma's house, her kids would groan and try to get out of it. "She's too much," Rachel finally admitted. "She tries to make everything about her." Mother-in-law must have sensed that she was losing Rachel too, because suddenly she started hinting at mysterious health problems. She didn't give details, just vague mentions of not feeling well. Little sighs about how hard everything had been lately. A few relatives bought into it and tried pressuring Rachel and me to reach out. Father-in-law, however, wasn't playing along anymore. He pulled me aside and told me directly, "She's fine. No health issues, no real problems, just another attempt to get sympathy." When mother-in-law tried pressuring father-in-law to fix the family, father-in-law did something he had never done before. He stood his ground. "They'll come back if they want to," he told her. "You can't force them." Mother-in-law was stunned. Father-in-law had always backed her up, had always tried to smooth things over, but now, he was done enabling her. Mother-in-law, desperate for any support, went back to social media. She posted another vague rant about how painful it is when your own family turns against you. But this time, nobody took the bait. Even her oldest supporters had stopped defending her. Rachel, now completely exhausted by mother-in-law's antics, made her final decision. She went low contact, only dealing with mother-in-law on major holidays, nothing more. No constant check-ins, no last-minute favors, no catering to mother-in-law's every whim. Mother-in-law didn't realize it yet, but she was officially alone. Father-in-law, without mother-in-law dragging him into constant drama, became more present in our lives. He showed up for Ethan and Lily, spent real time with them, and started repairing the damage mother-in-law had caused. Then mother-in-law made her last attempt. She called me directly. Her voice was meek, a complete contrast to the controlling, arrogant woman I had known for years. "Can we please start over?" I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't give her another chance to manipulate. I simply said, "We've already moved on. and that was it. With our kids out of the picture, mother-in-law turned her full attention to Rachel's family, and that's when things got even worse. Rachel's kids, who had once been mother-in-law's pride and joy, now felt the weight of her obsession. Mother-in-law had nothing else left to control, so she clung to them even harder. It started small, unannounced visits, constant demands for time, over-the-top reactions when they didn't immediately answer her calls. Rachel's husband, who had tried to stay out of the drama, finally stepped in. He put his foot down and told mother-in-law directly, "Back off. You're making this worse." Mother-in-law was stunned. She had always assumed Rachel's family would stand by her no matter what. Now, even they were pulling away. One afternoon, while playing outside, Ethan looked up at me and asked, "Daddy, when's the last time we saw Grandma?" I shrugged and changed the subject. That was the moment I realized our kids didn't even miss her. Father-in-law continued to step up. He took Ethan to baseball games, showed up to school events, and built the bond he should have built years ago. Mother-in-law, meanwhile, was completely alone. Relatives who had once defended her openly called out her favoritism. The extended family no longer saw her as the victim. Her influence was gone. Sarah and I didn't win because mother-in-law apologized. We won because we protected our kids from growing up feeling unwanted. That was the real victory. Months after going no contact, mother-in-law made one last attempt. A handwritten letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was thick, the handwriting more dramatic than usual. Inside was a long-winded plea, filled with flowery words about how she just wanted to be in the kids' lives, how she didn't care about the past anymore. She painted herself as the victim, how she had been cut off unfairly, how she just wanted to be a loving grandmother again. It was desperate. It went straight into the trash. Father-in-law, on the other hand, had changed. Now free from mother-in-law's influence, he became a regular presence in Ethan and Lily's lives. He showed up to school events, took them to the park, even called just to check in on their day. It was the kind of grandparenting mother-in-law had never once done. Rachel's tone started to change subtly over time. At first she dismissed our concerns, just like she always had. But then, cracks started to appear, frustrated sighs when Mill became overbearing, quiet agreements when she thought no one was listening. It wasn't a dramatic realization, but eventually, she admitted in a late-night message, "I think I finally get what you meant. It's exhausting." Rachel had finally put all the pieces together. She had spent years thinking mother-in-law's suffocating attention was love, only to realize it was control. She wasn't the only one who saw it. One afternoon, Rachel's oldest son looked at her and said, "I don't like being around Grandma anymore." That was the moment Rachel fully understood. Mother-in-law never truly cared about her grandkids. She cared about owning them. A few weeks later, on Sarah's birthday, mother-in-law tried again. A gift arrived at the door, wrapped neatly, with another long letter. Sarah sent it back unopened. Mother-in-law finally had no way in. Meanwhile, father-in-law visited again. This time it was casual. He sat on the porch with me, watching Ethan and Lily play outside. After a long pause, he sighed. "I don't know why I stayed with her so long." That was the moment I realized father-in-law finally saw mother-in-law for who she truly was. Without mother-in-law controlling everything, the family finally healed. Rachel and I, after years of tension, had dinner together for the first time in ages. No stress, no awkwardness, just normalcy. We laughed about how we used to think mother-in-law's behavior was normal. Without mother-in-law's toxicity, Ethan and Lily grew up without doubt. They never questioned their worth. They knew they were loved. Mother-in-law, once the center of everything, had nothing left. Her golden grandkids avoided her. Her husband spent time with family without her. Even the extended relatives had stopped defending her. Her legacy was nothing. Rachel finally made her decision. She went low contact permanently. No more constant calls. No more mother-in-law interference. Father-in-law, however, remained. He had changed, and he proved that people can change, if they want to. One night, as Sarah and I sat on the couch, she looked at me and smiled. This was the best decision we ever made, and she was right. Looking at our family, finally free, finally happy, I knew we had done the right thing. Mother-in-law lost everything, but we won.